Three men walked into Tommy Dorsey's hotel suite at 2:37 a.m. The first one smiled. The second one kept his hand inside his jacket on a gun. The third one carried a contract with Frank Sinatra's name on it. "We're here about the kid," the first man said. Tommy Dorsey, the most powerful band leader in America, looked at the gun, looked at the contract, and understood. Frank Sinatra was leaving. Tonight. Whether Tommy liked it or not, the contract Tommy made Frank sign in 1939 said Frank worked for him forever. 1/3 of Frank's earnings, every dollar, every year, for life. The contract was legal. The contract was airtight. Tommy owned Frank Sinatra. But the men standing in his suite at 2:37 a.m. didn't care about legal. They cared about Willie Moretti. They cared about the New Jersey mob. And they cared about making sure Frank Sinatra walked out of Tommy Dorsey's contract before sunrise. What happened in the next 47 minutes didn't just free Frank Sinatra. It revealed how the Mafia made stars in America, and how Tommy Dorsey learned that some contracts aren't worth dying for. To understand why three armed men showed up at Tommy Dorsey's hotel room, you need to understand what happened 4 years earlier. You need to understand how Frank Sinatra became a prisoner. June 1939. Frank Sinatra was 23 years old. He'd been singing with Harry James and his orchestra for 3 months. $50 a week, small venues, modest crowds. Frank was good, but he wasn't a star. Not yet. Then Tommy Dorsey came calling. Tommy Dorsey was the biggest bandleader in America. His orchestra sold more records than anyone except Bing Crosby. Playing with Tommy Dorsey meant playing the best venues, getting heard on national radio, making real money. For a kid from Hoboken who grew up watching his father struggle, Tommy Dorsey represented everything Frank wanted. Tommy offered Frank a job, lead vocalist, $75 a week, national tours, radio broadcasts, a real shot at stardom. But there was a contract. Frank's wife Nancy sat with him in their tiny apartment going over the terms. Most of it was standard. Salary, tour schedule, recording sessions. Then Nancy saw the clause on page 7. "Frank," she said, "look at this." The clause said that Tommy Dorsey would receive 1/3 of Frank Sinatra's gross earnings, not just from singing with the band, from everything, every record, every radio appearance, every movie. Every dollar Frank earned, Tommy got 33%. For life. "That's not normal," Nancy said. Frank was 23. He was hungry. He was desperate. And Tommy Dorsey was offering him the world. "It's fine," Frank said. "I'll make so much money, 1/3 won't matter." He signed. For the first year, the contract seemed fair. Frank was making $150 a week by 1940. Tommy took his cut. Frank didn't care. He was learning from the best, learning how to breathe, how to phrase, how to turn a lyric into a conversation. Tommy Dorsey's trombone playing taught Frank more about singing than any vocal coach ever could. By 1941, Frank Sinatra wasn't just Tommy Dorsey's singer. He was becoming a phenomenon. Bobby Soxers screamed his name. Fan clubs formed. Magazine profiles started appearing. Frank Sinatra was becoming bigger than the band. And that's when the contract became a problem. In 1942, Frank made $25,000. Tommy took $8,333. Frank was fine with that, but Hollywood came calling. RKO wanted Frank for a movie. The fee was $25,000. Tommy Dorsey's cut would be another $8,333. Frank did the math. If he became a movie star, if he went solo, if he made $1 million, Tommy Dorsey would take $333,333. Not for managing Frank, not for booking him, just for existing. Just because Frank signed a contract when he was young and stupid and desperate. Frank went to see Tommy in March 1942. "I want out," Frank said. Tommy Dorsey looked at him like he lost his mind. Out, Tommy said. Kid, we have a contract. I know, but it's not fair. I'm making you rich, Tommy. You're taking a third of everything. That's what you signed. I was 23. I didn't understand. Tommy leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, smiled. Frank, he said, you're breaking my heart. But a contract is a contract. You work for me. Forever. Get used to it. Frank tried lawyers. They read the contract. They said it was legal, unfair, but legal. Frank tried offering money. Tommy didn't need money. Tommy wanted control. He'd made Frank Sinatra. In his mind, he owned Frank Sinatra. By the fall of 1942, Frank was desperate. He was 27 years old. His career was exploding, and he was trapped. That's when Frank did something he would never publicly admit, something that wouldn't be confirmed until FBI files were released decades after his death. He called Willie Moretti. Willie Moretti was the underboss of the Genovese crime family. He controlled New Jersey, gambling, unions, nightclubs, politicians. If you wanted something done in Jersey, Willie Moretti made it happen. Frank Sinatra had known Willie since he was a kid. Willie hung around the same Hoboken neighborhoods Frank grew up in. He'd seen Frank sing at local clubs. He liked the kid, thought he had talent. When Frank started making it big, Willie took pride in that. A Hoboken boy making good. So when Frank called Willie in November 1942 and said he needed help, Willie listened. They met at a restaurant in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. Private room, just the two of them. Frank explained the situation, the contract, Tommy Dorsey's refusal to negotiate, the fact that Frank's entire future was being bled dry by a piece of paper he signed when he didn't know better. I'm trapped, Willie, Frank said, and I need out. Willie Moretti studied Frank. The kid was desperate. You could see it in his eyes. Willie understood desperation. It was a tool. You could use it or you could respect it. What do you want me to do? Willie asked. Talk to him, Frank said. Make him understand he needs to let me go. Willie nodded slowly, took a sip of wine. Frank, Willie said, Tommy Dorsey's a stubborn man. Talking might not be enough. Frank didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both understood what Willie was offering. And Frank, desperate and 27 years old with a wife and two kids and a future being stolen from him, didn't say no. Do what you need to do, Frank said. Willie made some calls. By December, he had a plan. Tommy Dorsey was scheduled to perform at the Paramount Theater in New York. He was staying at the Astor Hotel. Willie knew Tommy's schedule, knew when he'd be alone, knew the right moment to make an impression. January 26th, 1943. 2:37 a.m. Three men walked into the Astor Hotel. They walked past the night clerk without saying a word, took the elevator to the 8th floor, found Tommy Dorsey's suite, knocked. Tommy opened the door in his bathrobe, saw three men in expensive suits, knew immediately this wasn't a social call. Mr. Dorsey, the first man said, we're here about Frank Sinatra. They walked into the suite without being invited. The first man sat down in Tommy's chair. The second man stood by the door. His hand never left his jacket. The third man placed a contract on the table. Frank Sinatra's contract. Mr. Moretti would like you to reconsider your position, the first man said. Tommy Dorsey was 37 years old. He dealt with difficult people his entire career, difficult managers, difficult musicians, difficult club owners. But he'd never had three men show up at his hotel room at 2:37 in the morning with a gun. I have a legal contract, Tommy said. Legal doesn't matter, the first man said. What matters is Frank Sinatra walks away from this contract tonight, and you don't ask for a penny. Tommy's mind was racing. He could call hotel security. He could refuse. He could stand on principle. Then he looked at the second man's hand, still inside his jacket, still resting on something. "And if I say no?" Tommy asked. The first man smiled, not a friendly smile, a patient smile, the smile of someone who's had this conversation before and knows how it ends. "Mr. Dorsey," he said, "you're a smart man. You've built an incredible career. You have a wife. You have a future. We're offering you a very simple choice. Sign this release. Walk away. Keep everything you have, or don't sign, and deal with the consequences." The word consequences hung in the air like smoke. Tommy Dorsey had heard stories about Willie Moretti. Everyone in the music business had. Willie didn't make empty threats. Willie didn't bluff. If Willie sent 3 men to your hotel room at 2:37 in the morning, you listened. "How much does Frank want to pay?" Tommy asked. "Nothing," the first man said. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a release. You tear up the contract. Frank walks away clean. You get nothing except the privilege of waking up tomorrow morning." Tommy felt his hands start to shake. He'd built his empire on control. Control over his musicians. Control over his business. Control over people like Frank Sinatra. And now 3 strangers were sitting in his hotel room telling him that control was an illusion. "I made Frank Sinatra," Tommy said. "Without me, he's nothing." "That might be true," the first man said. "But without you, Frank becomes something else. Something bigger. And you either let him go, or you become a problem. And Mr. Moretti solves problems." The second man shifted his weight. His hand moved slightly inside his jacket, just enough for Tommy to see the outline of a gun. Tommy Dorsey thought about his wife, his children, his career, his life. And he thought about Frank Sinatra, the skinny kid from Hoboken he turned into a star. The kid who was now bigger than the band, the kid who wanted out. "Give me the contract," Tommy said. The third man handed it over. Tommy read through it one more time. Every clause he'd carefully constructed to ensure Frank Sinatra made him rich for life. Every word designed to protect Tommy's investment. Then he tore it in half. The first man smiled, stood up, buttoned his jacket. "Mr. Dorsey," he said, "you're a very smart man. You'll live a long, successful life. And you'll never speak about this conversation, because if you do, we'll have another conversation, and it won't be as pleasant." The 3 men walked out of Tommy Dorsey's hotel suite at 3:24 a.m. 47 minutes after they arrived. They left the torn contract on the table. They left Tommy Dorsey sitting in his bathrobe, shaking, understanding that he'd just lost control of Frank Sinatra forever. But he was alive. The next morning, Tommy called his lawyer, told him to draw up a release. No explanation, no negotiation, just release Frank Sinatra from all obligations. When the lawyer asked why, Tommy said, "Just do it." On January 27, 1943, Frank Sinatra was officially free. Tommy Dorsey told people for years that he released Frank out of generosity, out of respect, out of recognition that Frank deserved his independence. He never mentioned the 3 men, never mentioned the gun, never mentioned Willie Moretti. Frank Sinatra also never talked about it publicly. When reporters asked how he got out of his contract, he said Tommy was reasonable, that they worked it out like gentlemen. But people close to Frank knew. His wife Nancy knew. His manager knew. And the FBI, which had been watching Frank's connections to organized crime for years, knew. In 1959, when Frank was subpoenaed to testify before a Nevada gambling commission, they asked him directly, "Did you have mob help in getting out of your contract with Tommy Dorsey?" Frank's answer was simple. "I told Tommy I was leaving. He let me go." It wasn't until decades after Frank's death that FBI documents confirmed what people suspected, that Willie Moretti's men visited Tommy Dorsey, that a gun was involved, that the Mafia freed Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's freedom came with a price, not money, something more valuable. something that would follow him for the rest of his life: loyalty. Willie Moretti didn't ask Frank for payment, didn't demand a percentage of Frank's future earnings, but the favor was understood. Frank Sinatra owed the mob, and the mob would collect when they needed to. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Frank maintained relationships with organized crime figures. He performed at mob-owned clubs. He socialized with known criminals. He allowed himself to be photographed with men like Sam Giancana, Lucky Luciano, and of course, Willie Moretti. The FBI opened a file on Frank Sinatra that eventually grew to over 1,300 pages. They documented every mob connection, every suspicious relationship, every favor exchanged. In 1947, Frank traveled to Havana, Cuba. The FBI believed he was delivering money to Lucky Luciano, who'd been deported from the United States. The FBI believed the money was payment. Payment for the Tommy Dorsey favor. Payment for other favors. Payment to stay in the mob's good graces. Frank always denied it, said he was just entertaining friends, just enjoying Havana. But the FBI didn't believe him. Neither did the press. For the rest of his career, Frank Sinatra carried the stigma of mob connections. When he tried to open a casino in Nevada, the Gaming Commission investigated his ties to organized crime. When he campaigned for John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy worried Frank's mob connections would hurt the campaign. And when Willie Moretti was murdered in 1951, shot to death in a New Jersey restaurant, Frank attended the funeral. Because you don't forget the man who freed you, even if that freedom came from the barrel of a gun. Tommy Dorsey never spoke publicly about that night. He continued leading his orchestra, continued making hit records, continued being one of the most respected band leaders in America. But something changed in Tommy after January 26, 1943. Friends noticed he was more cautious, more careful about his contracts, more aware that power, no matter how legal, how official, how contractual, can be taken away in 47 minutes by three men with a gun. Tommy Dorsey died in 1956. He was 51 years old, choked to death in his sleep after a heavy meal and too much alcohol. Some people whispered that the mob finally settled an old score, that someone remembered Tommy's contract, that someone remembered Tommy tried to own Frank Sinatra. But most likely, Tommy just died. Because sometimes death is random. Sometimes there's no conspiracy. Sometimes the most powerful band leader in America just chokes in his sleep. Frank Sinatra never attended Tommy Dorsey's funeral. When reporters asked why, Frank said he was too busy, had a recording session, couldn't make it. But people close to Frank said the real reason was simpler. Frank never forgave Tommy for that contract, never forgave him for trying to own him, never forgave him for making Frank choose between his career and his freedom. And even though Willie Moretti's men solved the problem, even though Frank got his freedom, he never forgot what Tommy tried to do. Some debts you pay with money, some debts you pay with loyalty, and some debts you never pay at all. The Tommy Dorsey contract became the defining moment of Frank Sinatra's career, not because of what it represented legally, but because of what it taught him about power. Frank learned that talent wasn't enough, success wasn't enough, even fame wasn't enough. What mattered was control. Control over your career, control over your money, control over your destiny. After breaking free from Tommy Dorsey, Frank spent the rest of his life making sure no one ever controlled him again. When he signed with Columbia Records, he negotiated clauses that gave him creative control. When he moved to Capitol Records in 1953, he demanded and received unprecedented artistic freedom. When he founded Reprise Records in 1961, he became his own boss entirely. Frank Sinatra learned his lesson. Never sign away your power. Never let someone own you. Never trust that a handshake or a smile or a promise means anything when there's a contract involved. And never ever sign a contract that lasts forever. But Frank also learned something else, something darker, something he carried with him until his death in 1998. He learned that sometimes, to be free, you have to make deals with dangerous people. You have to call in favors from men who solve problems with guns instead of lawyers. You have to accept that your success, your freedom, your entire career might be built on a foundation that includes blood. The FBI never stopped investigating Frank Sinatra. From 1943 until the 1980s, they documented his mob connections. They interviewed witnesses. They collected evidence. They built a case that Frank Sinatra was, at minimum, a mob associate, at maximum, a mob asset. They never charged him with a crime, never found enough evidence to prosecute, but the file remained. 1,300 pages of suspicion, speculation, and surveillance. And at the heart of that file was one question. What did Frank Sinatra owe Willie Moretti? The FBI believed the answer was everything. They believed that without Willie Moretti's intervention, Frank Sinatra would have spent his entire career trapped in Tommy Dorsey's contract. His talent would have been wasted, his potential unfulfilled, his legacy non-existent. Willie Moretti freed Frank Sinatra, and in return, Frank gave Willie something more valuable than money. He gave him loyalty. He gave him access. He gave him legitimacy. When Willie Moretti walked into a nightclub with Frank Sinatra, he wasn't just a mobster. He was Frank Sinatra's friend. And that changed everything. Frank always said he didn't regret his mob connections, didn't regret calling Willie Moretti in 1942, didn't regret what happened to Tommy Dorsey at 2:37 a.m. I did what I had to do, Frank said years later, and I'd do it again. Because for Frank Sinatra, freedom wasn't just valuable, it was everything. And if the price of freedom was a lifetime of FBI surveillance, congressional hearings, and whispered accusations, Frank was willing to pay it. Tommy Dorsey's contract taught Frank Sinatra the most important lesson of his life. Your career, your success, your entire future can be taken away by a piece of paper you signed when you were young and desperate. Unless you're willing to fight for it, unless you're willing to call in favors from dangerous people, unless you're willing to accept that sometimes the only way to break a legal contract is with illegal means. Three men walked into Tommy Dorsey's hotel suite at 2:37 a.m. on January 26, 1943. They carried a gun, they carried a contract, and they carried a message from Willie Moretti. Frank Sinatra was leaving, tonight, whether Tommy liked it or not, and in those 47 minutes, Frank Sinatra learned what power really meant. Not talent, not fame, not even money. Power meant being willing to do whatever it took to be free. The story of Frank Sinatra and Tommy Dorsey's contract became legend in the music industry. Every young artist heard it. Every manager referenced it. Every contract negotiation included the unspoken threat, "Don't try to own me, because if you do, I'll find a way out." Some people saw Frank's decision to involve the mob as proof he was corrupt, that his success was tainted, that everything he accomplished was built on a foundation of organized crime. Other people saw it as survival, as a young man doing whatever it took to escape an unfair contract, as proof that sometimes the legal system doesn't protect you. Sometimes you have to protect yourself. Frank Sinatra never apologized for what he did, never expressed regret, never suggested he would have handled it differently. "Tommy tried to own me," Frank said, "and nobody owns Frank Sinatra." That attitude, that defiance, that absolute refusal to be controlled by anyone became the defining characteristic of Frank Sinatra's career. It made him powerful. It made him legendary. It made him Frank Sinatra. But it also made him dangerous, because everyone knew that if you crossed Frank Sinatra, if you tried to control him, if you tried to take what was his, he had friends who solved problems. Friends who knocked on doors at 2:37 in the morning. Friends who carried guns. The Tommy Dorsey contract was supposed to last forever. 33% of everything Frank earned. For life, it lasted 4 years. Because some contracts aren't worth the paper they're written on, and some people refuse to be owned. What would you have done? Would you have stayed trapped in a legal contract and let someone else control your future? Or would you have made the call Frank made? Frank Sinatra chose freedom, and he never looked back.